I actually have some materials for you, Dan, that you might enjoy, namely a bunch of different essays and collected volumes that are all about reading the theme of the abject in horror movies and in sort of, well, there's some overlap with what we talked about with the uncanny, but
yes, that's what I want to ask about.
Yeah. But I was thinking specifically one of the classic places, let's call it the Loki classic-y, that people find the abject in films is David Lynch's Mulholland Drive with the sort of demonic person behind the dumpster, right? Or diving into the ear in Blue Velvet, right? These sort of moments where this kind of horrifying chasm opens up beneath the viewer and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah, there's this one bit, we're not going to get to it because this is not just like a close reading episode because we want to do some work with the abject, but there is one bit of this essay where Kristeva talks about like their relationship to the sublime, which of course is, you know, is while it is also like a feeling of what I guess we could now call, which Kant didn't have this language, but like overwhelm.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, it's often, the sublime isn't horrifying, but it also like, it dislodges you in some sort of way. But I also feel like, Dan, like I was amped for you to read this because the abject is all about body horror.
I got that for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, like every time I see a Cronenberg film, I think about this essay.
The question that I had coming out of this immediately was, maybe it's less a question, more an observation. I got similar vibes from this. This is more of a comment
than a question.
Yeah,
Dan, you've been hanging out with academics for so long that you finally, this is more of a comment than a question.
Uncanny. When I was reading about the uncanny, useful terminology to have because I already was able to kind of recognize what Freud was poking at before I had read that paper.
Yeah.
Because I think the uncanny is a universal experience. Hence why we used it as a bridge, like a jumping off point into talking about like your experience with the unconscious. You're already having it, whether or not you know it under those terms. With the abject, I get a super uncanny vibe from it. Like it's touching on a lot of similar things insofar as that it's about this eerie place between borders and how that reflects back on the viewer. But my impression is that as Kristeva plays it out here, the abject leaves room for renegotiation, where the uncanny is this like immediate thing.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Like that. I actually like that a lot.
This is such a weird essay and it's such a slippery concept that I think part of how it works is it both like overlaps with other concepts and other things we've read while also trying to distinguish itself from them in ways that are not necessarily consistent. Like she says, well, I'm not necessarily dealing in the uncanny here. And in fact, I'm opposed to it. Like, but also there is a lot of overlap with the uncanny, particularly when she starts talking about like, I don't know, like bodies or bodily functions. And this is a little more lowbrow, I guess, than Mulholland Drive, but I was thinking about like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or there's all these body parts on the table, or that other horror movie you recommended to me, the Autopsy of Jane Doe, where like bodies are coming alive in the morgue and maybe they're not actually dead and maybe the dead person's a witch. Sorry, spoiler. But
good ass movie though, worth watching. Go watch it.
I was not going to watch that movie, so
it's horrifying. Yeah, it's a scary one. But that's also kind of a neat connection here because it points to what I think Kristeva's trying to get at more specifically than Freud even has like the conceptual resources to deal with, let alone the personal experiences to deal with, namely the way in which the uncanny, like the unhome-like, right? The thing that's both so near, but then kind of threatens to overwhelm you or consume you or push you away, right? You go back home to it, but also you're horrified by it. And you're like, wow, home was never home to begin with. When we're talking about that kind of dynamic, the thing she immediately wants us to go to is like the maternal body, right?
Yeah.
The mother is the place that we all come from.
Yeah. And thus like a primordial kind of horror. I mean, Freud got this a little bit when he talks about like genitals and how we're like horrified by them yet attracted to them. But he doesn't have, I think you're right, quite the language. And I mean, one thing that I'll put out here, not only is the abject sort of paradigmatically reflected in or encapsulated by, I'm groping for words here, as you might be able to tell from my voice. I'm a little under the weather. Not only the maternal body, but also other people's response to the maternal body, and specifically the like oozy, not solid, but also not necessarily totally liquid, in between states products of it. And here's what I wanted to say that's been helpful to me in reading Kristeva beyond just this piece on abjection, but I think you never want to say that there's like a master key to any one thinker, right? But Kelly Oliver, who is a remarkable contemporary philosopher and also a Kristeva scholar, among many other things, puts it. I'm not. I don't have this in front of me, so I'm thinking about it from memory. But it's something like, for Kristeva, like a good thing to remember is the body is always structured by language, and language is always structured by the body. And that, I think, is something that you might be able to read in Freud in plenty of ways. Certainly in the conversations we've been having about hysteria, right? Like those are actually, those two things are intimately related. But to me, that's something that I think is really helpful as we get into not only this essay, but spin out some of its contemporary political resonances, which are the occasion for us talking about Kristeva on abjection. Just something to keep in mind, that these two things are like not only indissociable, but also that like one always structures the other. And this is this sort of like dialectical relationship that you have to kind of always be thinking with.
Abby, that's so helpful, because what it highlights is also, I think, a way to answer your question, Dan, about like what's the distinction between the uncanny and the abject, apart from the fact that these are, concepts associated with two different thinkers that, are integrated into various systems that are different for both of them. And that's how it relates to both the idea of language and the relationship of language to the body and bodies to language. Because one, Kristeva is interested in these questions of like sexual difference or the sexuation as a type of differentiation, right? As this kind of force in ways that Freud isn't. But also, and this is key, when we talk about the uncanny, we're talking about a thing, right? It's a thing we encounter. It's a noun, right? It's
This is crucial, I think.
Yeah, it's like it's out there in the world, or it's something in our perception, but it's a substantive noun first and foremost.
Yeah, you can point to it, be like, those puppets are fucking uncanny.
Yeah, there's no verb for it, right? Some other languages, I think the Russian formalists have this idea of like defamiliarizing, and I think like Brecht and some other of these Germans will have this language about like making things unfamiliar for an audience as like an aesthetic effect.
Mm-hmm.
But there isn't a transitive verb like for making something uncanny, like uncanny-izing, etc. Whereas for this tag, the abject or abjection or abject, for Kristeva, it's not just a phenomena that happens in the world or a thing that we encounter, though it is that, right? It is these, it's the bodies on the table or the sort of monstrous, unkempt person in the David Lynch. It's also, at the same time, always a type of process and a verb that's reenacted. It's making things abject. Or like we encounter the abject, these things that revolt us, in a process of being revolted and designating certain things as revolting to us. And that sort of dynamic ongoing process where the abject is both a thing that we encounter, but a thing that we make or that we recognize as abject, and how that consolidates or undoes us, has direct political implications.
Listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Klutchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Dan Yowell.
And today we are talking about Julia Kristeva's notion of abjection or the abject or to abject. Man, we're talking about a lot of things, but we're not doing... Like, this isn't one of our like Lacan episodes that goes on for like a million episodes, like for a million installations. We are gonna, give a good hard look. Sorry, that's probably not great phrasing given what we're talking about. But we're gonna give our careful attention to an essay that is part of Julia Kristeva's 1980 book, Powers of Horror. We're going to look at the chapter that's called Approaching Abjection, which is one but not the only place to look at this concept. And we're going to spend some time walking through key moments in the essay as a way of kind of like texturing and retexturing this concept, which has as one of its major features the fact that it's like constantly teaching you how to not approach it, because like literally the title of the essay is Approaching Abjection. And one of the ways that you have to approach it is like over and over and over. And you have to kind of sort of like Freud with a symptom, you have to kind of sneak up on it again and again. So I want us to spin out a couple of what we find to be the most helpful ways of thinking about this concept, but it's not because we're doing like a Kristeva episode per se. It's because we have been sitting around trying to think about what is helping us understand some things going on in this particular political and cultural moment. Two of the things that I will just mention, as I was the one that was like, hey, let's look at this essay, is I've been thinking a lot about Alligator Alcatraz and the press coverage of it. Of course, we've been thinking about the quote unquote big, beautiful bill. I guess that, there are a lot of different ways to talk about immiseration. And some of them are more flexible and generative than others. And I do think abjection, because it resonates in all of these different ways, like here's one that's like really, really low stakes, is like, Patrick and I have been sick for the last 2 months, right? So we were sitting on the porch the other day being really self-pitying, and I was like, oh, poor thing. And I was like, you look so pathetic. You look literally abject. You can use it in as kind of light. I mean, that's not light, and maybe I should have been nicer, Patrick. I'm sorry. You're always beautiful.
It's okay. I can't hear you. My ears are totally clogged.
But you can use it in the sense of like a way that you're feeling, right? Again, it's a flexible word, but it's also a word that is a verb, right? It's not just an adjective. It's not just a noun. It is also very much a verb. You can abject others. And we are living in this moment when abjection is a feeling that so many of us are having, even as many of those people, and I include myself and Patrick in this, we are not suffering the brunt of, the ways in which the state is actively abjecting more and more folks, right? Through legislation, through policy, through rhetoric, I could go on and on.
Yeah, and I think in a similar key, I think the concept of the abject, as we're going to play with it, right? Because we're not doing a line by line close reading Kristeva, also may help people have another tool for thinking about something we've gotten at in, our episodes with Brian Goldstone.
I was thinking about that too.
Our episodes with Jade Davis about empathy, right? Or our conversation with Stephen Thrasher about disability and COVID. In other words,
and also our conversation with Lauren Dent about psychosis.
Yeah, these sort of production of, materially speaking, like these populations of people who are deemed disposable or who the state will harm in various ways, but also like the way in which their specter or images of them, right, either as a trope or literally photos, media of such people, are invoked or activated in our own consciousness in ways that provoke very intense feelings, right? What we've talked about is like, there for the grace of God go I, right? These fears of contagion, or these like moments of differentiation where you're like, well, at least I'm not that person.
Right.
Or, right, or you're thinking about Olufemi Taiwo, like at least I can say that I'm not in the global South, right? Like these sort of moments of both like logical operation and differentiation, but also of affective saturation with these feelings, again, of like revulsion, but also fascination and negation or disavowal combined with these operations of power.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And Patrick, I know I wanted to say a few things about how to read this essay. It's been a while since we, I keep wanting to say, like, assigned you something to read. We didn't assign you anything. You don't have to read anything. I mean, go ahead, please, like, obviously. But I have read this essay a number of times. And I'm going to share with you something that I say to my students often when I assign something that, not that they're going to complain about, but that they are going to feel overwhelmed by, which is I give them, this is, some of you are going to be like, oh my God, this is so reductive. So I'm sorry, just like sit on it for a minute. I give them a scale of 1 to 10 and I say, where are you with this text? Where 1 is complete confusion. I have no idea what's going on. I understood nothing. And 10 is like Hegelian absolute knowledge, total mastery. And I often am like, come in having read this at like a 4, and then we'll try to like get to like a 6 to 8 by the end of the class. And my life got a lot easier once I started giving myself that same grace. One of the things, and I was saying this to Patrick earlier, but I think it bears repeating. And I know he's got a few things that I've found very helpful in terms of like, how do you actually read French theory, right? Like, how do you actually do it? Whether you're doing it in French, whether you're doing it in translation, whatever. I'm going to share with you something that a French professor once said to me in college, and I found it so helpful, which is like, if you're reading these like incredibly dense theoretical texts, which are also because citation practices are quite different here, like, you know, where you would often in like an Anglo-American academic paper expect to see like a citation whenever there's a reference to like a particular concept. That shit doesn't exist there. It's just like, it's intertextuality all the way down, right? And if you miss the reference, you miss the reference, and like, well, then maybe you're lost forever. And so this professor said, you know, when you're reading this kind of stuff, and I think he said it about Lacan and Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari and whatever, he was like, if you read a sentence or a paragraph and you don't understand it, like, don't worry about it. Just keep reading. Like, you can always go back. That's my advice to you, is like, don't be like, what is like the propositional content of each one of these sentences? Like, that way lies madness.
Can I ask you on that note, Dan?
Yeah.
Can I just check in with you? Because I've also read this a bunch of times over the years. Dan, this was the first time read for you. Can I just ask your initial reactions to style, or just like your vibes from this thing? Both, like, what did it feel like to go through this for the first time?
I, for one thing, I had to read a chunk of it out loud. My poor wife had to sit and listen to me because I had to like work through the language very intentionally, which I don't know. I can't say that I loved it. It was very challenging, but my biggest takeaway, I think, is that my impression from the paper is that she's not writing so that I walk away with like clear, hard and fast definitions that I get to apply in everyday language. She's more worried about, or more concerned with, a kind of affective transfer, where I come away from any given paragraph feeling a way about what she's saying, and then I was able to wrestle with that
the
feeling.
thesis of my dissertation, so that makes me feel really great.
Okay,
to hear you articulate that without my ever having said anything about it.
Yeah, right. You listeners can't see it, but Abby's slipping me a $20 bill right now for saying the right thing.
No, we're on Zoom right now.
Yeah, I know, we have to record remote.
It's actually Bitcoin.
Dan, I'm so glad you said that, because like her prose and in general, but in this essay and book in particular, is super hard.
Yeah.
And it can be super frustrating. And I think, to second what Abby said, when reading Kristeva, but this also applies to Lacan or many other thinkers who are in what we would call like the continental philosophical tradition, in translation or otherwise, try and read it out loud.
Yeah.
Right? See how it sounds. because one way to read it is to read it the way you would read, or imagine you would read poetry.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And
And treat it the way you treat poetry.
exactly, because, and this seconds something you just said, Dan, even if none of us are like big poetry heads, we do all have this sense that, like, when you're reading a poem, it's not about like decoding the meaning of the poem, right? In the sense that you're like, a poem is a mathematical equation or a simple proposition. The rhymes are not transcribable into a one-to-one set of like statements. Instead, a poem operates on a kind of level of, well, effect, right? It has
Can
an
I throw
impact
a
on.
Freudian metaphor in here real quick?
Sure.
You know how in the interpretation of dreams, it's always like weirdly shocking that the manifest latent distinction leads Freud to be like, no, like you can figure out what a dream is about and you can summarize it in one sentence. Play with the manifest here. Like, don't just try to like understand the latent.
Yeah. And to continue with the poetry analogy, right? Like, if you're reading a poem, and again, I'm saying this understanding that people may not read that much poetry. I don't read as much poetry as I once did, right? Like,
You still read poetry. You read poems out loud to me.
Oh, well, thank you. But if you're reading a poem, sometimes you don't get it, or you don't get all of it. But occasionally you have a line that's like, oh, that's beautiful, right? Or it sticks with you.
It's sticky.
Yeah. And so when you go through these texts, even if you feel like, don't go through it being like, okay, now what she's saying and how did she move from this to that? Or how did Lacan move from this argument to that argument? Or what does this term mean here versus there? I mean, you can do that later if you want on that second read or third read, right?
10th read.
Yeah, but just see what sticks, what like leaps out at you as being kind of beautiful or striking or sounds profound, and just let yourself kind of go with the flow of the language as it goes forward, right? And that's, I think, particularly salient here, and for thinking about French theory in general, insofar as that, well, first, like, if you're reading in English, you're reading in translation. And one of the things about the French language and French theory in particular in French is that as a Romance language, you can pun a lot more within sort of like the vocabulary in question.
There's a lot more homophones.
Yeah, there are a lot more homophones. There are a lot more things that rhyme. English, with this combination of this Latinate and Germanic vocabulary, you just can't pun in quite the same ways, right? So, in other words, if you're reading it in the original, but also this is why I want you to read it out loud, or at least the passages, some of it out loud, you get these like sense of these like words sounding like other words. In other words, like repetitions and what we might call like allusions.
Kind of what I was calling intertextuality.
Yeah, this makes you think of another thing, or this thing sounds like another thing. And that process of like being attuned to that is part of how the text tries to make you feel certain things, or to associate what it's talking about, not just in terms of like, this is a concept, right? But how language actively makes concepts, and language is, how we approach concepts, but also it has feelings to it, right? Concepts do work, but they're kind of conjured. Another way of kind of saying this is that part of how these texts work, or hopefully my poem might work too, is to emphasize that language has a power. It does something. And sometimes also language is like weirdly haunted, right? Words are haunted by other words, texts that you've heard, right? And that's trying to put you in a particular relationship to both the concepts that are being talked about, like what is the abject, but also how like those concepts and terms relate to other texts, narratives, phrases that you may be aware of, or not even think about until you read the text like this. So like, if it's hard, if it makes you feel weird, that's part of the point.
Yeah. And I think it bears, I'm not going to do a lot of like Kristeva related ground clearing here, but I think it bears just like contextually, given what both of you are saying, mentioning that Powers of Horror, the book that this comes from, is part of what you could call a kind of trilogy that Kristeva writes. All around the same time. This book on horror, there's another book on love, which is Tales of Love. And then there is another book on melancholia called Black Sun. And so like this is a period in her work where, again, the body and language are always at issue, but where we might today call like affects or feelings are, as Dan said, not only being like evoked, but thematized explicitly.
I had this mental image reading this of like, I couldn't help but compare this to like reading Lacan, who's like doing card tricks while he talks, or Freud, who's got like a drafting table and is like trying to be precise with his language.
Yes.
And in my head, I was imagining Kristeva, don't judge me. She's like playing with a butterfly knife. She's like flipping the blade around and stuff like that. And I want to go in close to like figure out how she's doing that, but also there's a part of me that has to pull back and is like a little scared.
Yeah.
There's that she defines abjection a couple of times in this paper, and I just want to do you mind if I just read this one that really stuck with me?
Please.
Sure.
If you contrast this with the way like a Freud talks about a concept like uncanny, where he's again very precise, this thing will lead to this thing, which unveils this thing or something like that. It's all about like behavioral processing and stuff like that. She says that abjection, on the other hand, is immoral, sinister, scheming, and shady, a terror that disassembles, a hatred that smiles, a passion that uses the body for barter instead of inflaming it, a debtor who sells you up, a friend who stabs you. It's beautiful. And also I want to recoil a little bit. Like she makes me afraid of what she's describing. It's great.
Yeah. It makes you like, this is the thing. It makes you feel weird.
Yeah.
Right. It's supposed to make you feel weird. And it
It makes you feel
poetic.
horrified.
Yeah. It makes you feel, it makes you feel a little vertiginous, a little nauseated, a little confused, but also weirdly fascinated. You're both drawn in and pushed away at the same time. And maybe another way to think about this, and now this will segue into my saying some stuff about, reading French theory in general, just to clarify some of the terms or concepts that are at play in this text, is that a lot of what thinkers like her are doing in this period after the Second World War, writing paradigmatically in French, but they have their imitators and successors, et cetera, and other traditions too.
She's Bulgarian, by the way.
Yeah,
she's
polyglot.
It is a misnomer to call her one of the French feminists. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
pedantic. But
I mean, this is much the same way too. Like Derrida is another figure who writes like this is Algerian, not from metropolitan France. What the word French there does is it puts emphasis on the language that they're using, namely they're writing in French, in a particular type of French, right? And what they're trying to do as exemplars of what we might call like the linguistic turn is to make us think about how language has power, how language does things, but also it conceals some things. It both clarifies and mystifies, but above all, operationally speaking, in terms of the vibes, in terms of reading it, you can read the project as being about kind of making language itself uncanny for the reader.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
So we put a little more flesh on these bones really quick, just in terms of like both reading Kristeva and thinking about thinkers like her, or reading texts by thinkers like her in general, right? Which is that this interest in language, right? And this sort of like sometimes tortured, sometimes beautiful, sometimes horrifying, sometimes
all three,
revolting language is trying to do, or like what frequently happens with it, like sort of like the poles it kind of gravitates toward, is about making us put pressure on a certain like basic vocabulary of concepts, right? And specifically concepts that we kind of oppose in what you might call like distinctions, opposites, binaries. And those would be, for example, and exemplarily here for our purposes, space and time, the beginning of something and its ending, presence and absence. Note that these are pairs, all right? Space, time, inside, outside, beginning, endings. Those are about as like big picture, again, as you can get in the work of French theorists or people in this sort of space. Those abstractions are going to have a kind of vibe to them. They're going to get coordinated in a sort of constellation, we could say. And that constellation is going to have certain dynamics or themes, right? So they're exploring these things to put pressure on both how we relate those conceptual pairs to one another, but also just like kind of like what are the architectonics, the structuring principles of how we think in general. And they're thus going to highlight kind of two things, or they're going to be two themes that are going to be kind of popping up recurrently. One is that these terms that seem to be sort of opposite of one another, and we might think they're totally opposite, right? Space and time are different dimensions. Inside, you're here. Outside, you're out there. Or the beginning is different from the ending, right? The thing starts versus the thing ends, are actually only thinkable in relation to one another. You can't have an inside with also having an outside to compare it to, right? You can't have a ending unless you have a beginning, vice versa, right? There's kind of paradoxical revelation that these things that seem to be opposites are actually related to one another. So there's this kind of process of revealing that things that we take to be opposites are in fact paradoxically or not interdependent on one another. The second thing that's going to kind of recurrently happen is they're kind of going to layer these conceptual pairs on top of one another, right? They're going to think about how beginnings relate to endings in terms of, say, a logic of inside versus outside. Or how does the beginning of time relate to some sort of logic of space? How do these things kind of mirror one another or maybe differ from one another? Or how do they productively generate certain things? So oftentimes what they'll do is kind of repeatedly offer definitions of things or return back to certain things, adding on these additional layers of meaning or going back to, a different set of terms in order to kind of point out how these things are continually interpenetrating or interdependent. There's also going to be a kind of thematic or like narrative quality to this in some ways, or there are going to be certain narrative preoccupations, by which I mean there's an emphasis on processes of exclusion or negation. And I mean this both in the sense that, they're going to be emphasizing how like the absent relates to the present, or how you only have presence if you have you can think about the absent, but also there's going to be a preoccupation with patterns or like we could call operations of exclusion, of denying, of covering something up. And those operations of exclusion, covering up, denying, disavowing, whatever you want to call it, right, are understood to be constitutive of how we make stuff, of how we build concepts, how we build institutions, how we create stories. Another way of saying that, and you can see why this is so hard to talk about, even trying to, as best I can, like fairly straightforward English, they're going to talk about the ways in which the construction of things is related to the destruction of things, or how when things fall apart, we see how they are made. So that's one thing, like this emphasis on negation as a process, or this like the way in which paradoxically negating certain things, covering things up, disavowing things actually produces yet other things. But, and this is crucial, this recurrent pattern of sort of how these basic binaries exclude one another, but also depend on one another, is always understood to be dynamic, by which I mean it's always happening. They're interested in processes that are ongoing. Thus, for example, and crucially, when they're preoccupied with what they call like originary narratives or origin stories, or we might call meta-narratives, grand stories about the world, existence, our relationships to one another, politics, religions, gender, whatever it might be, it's never just like a just so story or an origin myth. It's understood as being an ongoing process of retelling that also constitutes something. It's dynamic. It happens over and over again. And that creation of an absence, or that tarrying with negativity, is reprised even when things are most present. So in other words, a recurrent theme, or like a kind of gesture that's going to happen across these texts, but Kristeva in particular too, is like, oh, here's how a thing is made, but wait. As I narrate how it's made, as it establishes itself, as we take this story for granted, whatever, we're continually also being haunted by the thing that undoes it.
Yeah, I was going to say unmaking
Yeah.
is like not a terrible way of thinking about like what the abject does.
And one quick way to remember this type of thing, if you really want like a little like mnemonic for it, right, is that a word that oftentimes gets used, deconstruction in English, is in French both the opposite of construction, but also the particle de is also of. So construction and deconstruction is also construction and about the construction.
Mm-hmm.
So a thing gets built and it contains within it the sort of the seeds of its own undoing, but also thinking about how a thing that gets built means that you also have to think about how it gets undone, or how it's always kind of fragile or dynamically constituted. Now, the last thing to say here, and this is kind of, I think, makes it a little bit, if you'll forgive me, kind of distinctively French, right, is that these processes of the creation of the inside and the outside, or the tension between space and time, or how absence relates to presence, is, for better or worse, troped with themes of like desire, yearning, and want or need in relation always to a kind of lack.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't like the sort of French theory vocabulary, but I'm going to throw it in here, is longing.
Yeah. It's always like
A
this
sort of like primordial longing.
Yeah, it's like this thing is initially absent, and it's a condition of possibility that this thing isn't here. And we have to say goodbye to the thing, or only by saying goodbye to a thing do we become ourselves, right? Again, like you might want to think about yourself like smoking a gauloise and wearing a beret, being like existence truly is a type of dance with nothingness, right? And I mean, I'm not trying to be abusive here, but there is that
That's
sort of
a different philosophical tradition.
yeah, but
I'm calling bullshit on that.
I think though, in terms of like the vibes of it, and this I think something that turns a lot of people off, right? There is a preoccupation with this idea of absence, lack, or non-arrival. Right?
I'm
it's
on
not
board
like
with that.
this is what abjection is. We're approaching abjection. We can maybe never get there. And again, the point here in all this is that if we have this sort of exploration of these basic binaries, inside, outside, space, time, being in presence, and it's all saturated with questions about desire and these ongoing processes of the creation of narratives. This all matters because for thinkers like Kristeva, we can now turn with some provocative results to thinking about some of the most basic narratives that structure our lives.
Yeah.
Narratives about the creation of things like states or what they're for, or, what the economy is, or crucially and most philosophically for our purposes here, what is this thing called the subject? How does it come into being?
Yeah. And can I just riff on this for 1 second, say that one of the things that you're talking about here also, and that's going to be really important politically, is you are implicitly talking about boundaries. Like what makes a state, or a nation, whatever, is its relationship to other nations, right? And the fact that one thing is not the other thing. And the same thing in terms of like the subject. One of the ways that this is the earliest way, but also, as you said, dynamic, ongoing ways that we know that the subject is the subject, the self is the self, whatever language you want to use for it, is like it's not the other. Although, of course, it is dynamically constituted in and through the other. I'm eager to turn to the piece, but if you will allow us, listeners, one more prefatory note that I promise is going to pay dividends, not to get too involved in this cash money metaphor. Patrick, do you want to do the etymology of the word abject? Because we are going to, look, it's unavoidable that we're going to be talking about grammar to a certain extent, but I also think that, a lot of the words that we throw around on this podcast, whether it's like object, which of course means something different in the psychoanalytic context than it does in other contexts, or like things like introject, like they actually all share similar etymology. And I wonder if before we get to it, and I will lay my cards on the table and say, like, there are a lot of different kind of like movements, I guess you could call it. I'm almost thinking like musical movements in this piece, a couple of which I want to hit on very, very briefly, just to kind of like nuance and texture the idea, and a few where I want to linger more. But will you just offer us up a little bit on etymology first?
And note, and the appeal to etymology here, to like quote unquote the origins of words, isn't just incidental. This is a overdetermined and necessary feature of thinking about a thinker like Kristeva, because, and about, the linguistic turn in general, because concepts are named in words. And the words we have for concepts rhyme with one another or are related to one another structurally and grammatically. They are, we could say, haunted by one another in certain ways, such that when we're talking about one concept, we're also sort of thinking about another concept, much in the same way as, a rhyme in a poem in one line refers to something that happened earlier.
Yeah.
On a level, it's not just meaning, or rather it combines meaning with some other type of coordination. So yeah, like this term, the abject, as Abby's already stated, this is immediately sort of resonant with these other terms that we have. They're sort of basic, the object and the subject.
Oh yeah, I went straight to interject. I skipped the subject. Whoops.
But also, and I can think of a couple other like things that are both, sometimes verbs, sometimes nouns. In English, we have lots of these things like a reject or to reject.
Or eject.
Or to eject.
As in from consciousness.
Yeah. Or to, to subject as a verb, Or, really rapidly to think about a thing like an adjective, like a thing that modifies a noun. Injection, interjection, to interject, to jettison, to a project, a projectile. No, these are operations. They seem to suggest a type of movement. And they all go back, if you want to play historical linguistics, to a Proto-Indo-European verb, this yeah, right? Which, if you know Latin, right? Alia jacta est, the die is cast, right? This yeah means to throw, or it presumably, has been philologists have decoded it to mean to throw or to impel, right? And so if you're projecting something, you're throwing it outwards. If you're injecting something, you're tossing it inwards. If you are introjecting it, you're kind of sticking it deep in there, etc. This is also where we get terms like, adjective, ejaculation, jettison, etc. Right? These are all putting outs, putting ins. In other words,
they're motion.
Yeah. They're coordinating things in terms of inside and outside, folks.
In space.
Yeah. Right. Or in a type of physics of movement, of initial movement or subsequent trajectory. Another one there. What I'm trying to get at here, and again, these are the themes that haunt this word, but also literally give us a scaffolding for thinking of what Kristeva is doing in this essay and why I think abjection is an important concept to begin with. These themes of the up and the down, the inside and the outside, are not just spatial. They also kind of always involve logics of hierarchies. So when you start encountering uses of the word abject, historically speaking, in English, just to take that, if you think about something like abject poverty, from the Middle Ages onward, the abject as an adjective means lowly, poor, humble. To call a person abject might mean that they are, quote unquote, meanness of spirit, right? That they have meanness of spirit. Or we might have this idea of being cast down or cast out.
Yeah, that's really important.
And that's a verb, right? The abject, in that sense, involves, again, not just a physics, but what you might call a metaphysics. To be cast out or cast down maps onto logics of, like being cast out of the garden, falling from grace, etc. All these terms haunt this term and ramify in both psychoanalytic and, political senses, as we'll shortly see.
At the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, Patrick talking about like getting cast out of the garden, I really want you all to start thinking in terms of like, you also are abject if you're a queer kid that gets tossed out of your parents' house, right? Or if you are a member of a family that gets separated at a border, right? Okay. And this brings me to one of the things that I think is, I've alluded to already, and Patrick certainly has as well, with the etymology. And I hope you have all of these words now kind of like percolating around in your brain here, like inject, project, object, subject, and that you're hearing them as verbs, is that, there's a way in which we could use another kind of like French theory buzzword here, which is undecidability, to talk about this. But there is, I think it's fair to say that the answer to the question of like what part of speech this is, I understand that not everybody else is haunted by the questions of like what part of speech something is, but I am. I really think that you need to you need to have like a Hegelian response to this. This is both and it's not even both and because it's not just two things. It's like everything and. So the abject, as we're going to see, as we are, I swear, finally getting into this essay, and are going to read you some key moments from it, that it is like kind of in a sense this thing, in the sense that we can talk about it in relationship to like an object or a subject, that it is certainly an adjective. Think about the two examples that I just gave, that it would be really appropriate to refer to somebody in that situation as an abject person. And maybe, I said I didn't have to choose, but maybe I'm going to choose, maybe the most important one, at least for our analysis today, is abject as a transitive verb, that you can abject someone. Right. And that someone can be the object of your abjection. And the you there, that's just me like using English, but you certainly that you certainly can refer to a particular person. Like someone can make you abject. Say somebody breaks up with you, right? And you are you're falling apart. Like you actually have been abjected, right? Not only have you been like cast out of this charmed circle of two or whatever, no judgment, but also you're wretched. Like, and you don't feel like yourself. And so it's easy, I think, to get a grasp on that at the level of the individual. But where this language, and, you know, Kristeva doesn't really go there so much, which is one of the reasons we're going to like kind of hit you over the head with it is, you know, think about the state as an agent of abjection. And I can't even, or think about institutions as agents of abjection. And I don't think I can do any better than to refer you to the book that we just talked with Brian Goldstone about the working homeless in America and about like the many interlocking institutions that collaborate to abject more and more people. Okay, so think about abjection as something that can be done not only to one person and not only by one person, but that can happen as like a mass event.
Yes.
Right? So for just to give you a really clear political example, ever since 2016, ever since the rhetoric of we are going to build a wall, which on this podcast we could certainly, you know, analyze in terms of I don't know. Well, the anal and the need to push out or excrete or to wall off. But I think, honestly, the best way to think of it is as a kind of mass abjection.
Another way of saying this, and maybe this is a nice, those of you who are like, wow, this is all very abstract, where are we going with this? Just to hit this yet again, we can think, like the cash value of thinking about abjection is not just about understanding Kristeva, but comes home to roost when we think about the state and like discourse, if we want to use that type of language, as being preoccupied and almost like sustained by ongoing creations of abject populations.
Yeah.
Right. It's like surplus populations.
Absolutely.
And this is where, again, we're going to put a little bit of emphasis on how, for Kristeva, the abject really does cut across those binaries of space and time, of inside and outside, of beginning and ending, insofar as that, you know, to take the example Abby really gave, right, that I think is excellent. If you get rejected, pushed away by somebody, you might feel dejected, cast down, and you might even, in like the depths of your depression, see yourself as abject. And you might, I don't know, project your own resentments onto them. Who knows? But and this is just to highlight these themes of like migration and boundary maintenance that Abby's getting at, and where we're going to go in a second. The abject is, for Kristeva, going to involve some sort of complicated, almost like dream logic of being both pushed aside or down or out, but still also kept within.
Yes.
Right?
I think that's so well put. I just wanted to interject. I'm so sorry. I wanted to just like offer up another, like, I know what you all want is more vocabulary, but like I want to offer up like one more thing is just in these instances, I want to just throw a word out that actually, well, I actually don't know if it's Latinate. It probably is, whatever, is wretched. And here I am thinking actually about like Fanon and the wretched of the earth. But I am also thinking just about when you feel wretched and when you have been made wretched. I don't think that's like a terrible synonym at times. Okay.
For what it's worth, I think wretch is Old English, Anglo-Saxon, right?
Yeah.
But it does, again, like hit these tropes, right? The abject masses, the wretched masses yearning to be free. Right.
And
or
you
demanding uplift.
And you can't have, again, like you can't feel good unless someone else is wretched. Right. That's that same kind of mutual.
Well, yeah. You're getting at the thing that I feel like you guys have been kind of dancing around and that I've been looking forward to hearing you talk about, which hopefully we can get to, is the the role that a concept like abject
burned by
or
our
abjection.
own producer.
No. This is not me complaining at all. I'm enjoying this. The role of abjection or of the abject in, like, as a spotlight that's cast from a viewer that's experiencing something as abjected. That object reflects that spotlight back on the person throwing it and says something about that person making the distinction. Like
Yes.
to call somebody wretched is to declare yourself not one of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's something about
yeah.
abject and how it plays a role in like self-identification in a way.
You're actually setting me up for exactly where I wanted to go next,
Oh, beautiful.
Dan. Thank you. The very first heading in approaching abjection is neither subject nor object. And I think it is worth just lingering with that at first for a minute. So let me read a quick passage. When I am beset by abjection, the twisted braid of affects and thoughts I call by such a name does not have, properly speaking, a definable object. The abject is not an object facing me, which I name or imagine. Let me skip a little. What is abject is not my correlative, which, providing me with someone or someone else's support, would allow me to be more or less detached and autonomous. The abject has only one quality of the object, that of being opposed to I. If the object, however, through its opposition, settles me within the fragile texture of a desire for meaning, which as a matter of fact makes me ceaselessly and infinitely homologous to it, what is abject, on the contrary, the jettisoned object, is radically excluded and draws me toward the place where meaning collapses. So, I mean, at the risk of being glib, you know that internet thing, not X nor Y, but a secret third thing. That's the abject.
Yeah.
Right. It's neither subject nor object. It unsettles the entire sort of metaphysical structure of the idea that there is this subject and there is this object, and we can understand the relationship between those things, and that the subject is a sort of self-contained, shored up thing which walks around and is in relationship to objects which are external to it. So the abject, when there is an I, right, there is in some ways a subject here that encounters it, it throws you back upon the self and then also does some sort of almost destruction of the self, right? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at here, Dan. And maybe it will be helpful to think about some examples here that are really, really important for Kristeva. This essay actually has a little bit less about the maternal body than some of her other works. For that, I actually recommend reading her essay Stabat Mater in Tales of Love. But two examples that are super, super important here are revulsion, because again, this is something that makes the self convulse and cease to be in some sort of stable relationship to itself. And also the figure of the corpse. And the thing that these things have in common is what Kristeva calls uncleanness. And if you have a sensitive stomach, you might want to just tap out here for a minute, because we're going to give you some examples of things that you could call the abject, or you could say summon it, or you could say activate abjection. Patrick, I know you want to talk about vomit.
Yeah, and in some ways, this is the most granular, grotesque possible example, right?
And clarifying.
But it's also very clarifying, namely vomit, right? And this is what she names explicitly. Let's say you see something gross, that's the object in the world, and then you produce out of your body something that is also gross, right? Now, note, you're triggered by the thing, but the thing that you produce is not more of the thing. It's stuff from inside you.
Another gross thing.
Yeah. And if you look at it long enough, you're like, holy shit, my entire insides are full of this stuff. I've got yards and yards of intestines that are just churning with this gross nonsense. And out it's coming. And maybe even though contagiously make other people vomit too. And it smells terrible. But in other words, it's this thing that is and then if you start running with that, you get really oh my God, I'm just organs. I'm all these different biota and blood vessels and all this really gross stuff. I'd much rather be a body without organs. But the point here is that you produce out of you, because of an object in the world, a thing that is not the object, nor still you as a subject. You don't like spit out a little smaller version of you that says, oh my God, that's gross. Instead, you just like upchuck this stuff that is constitutive of you and which is both nauseating, like sensorially, but also kind of nauseating existentially in its implications. To use her language here, it's sort of a thing that puts you on the edge of non-existence and hallucination, of a reality that, if I acknowledge it, annihilates me.
Can I read a longer passage about this? Because I do feel like, look, I love abstraction. Abstraction is my jam. But every once in a while, you want to just be like, give me like a thing. Like, even if the thing that we're talking about is like the thing that rejects like the concept of thingness. I'm so sorry.
That's not abstract at all. Yeah.
For everything. I do think that where the abject makes sense to people in a really visceral way is in the realm of what Kristeva calls the improper or the unclean. And this is going to have all sorts of like interesting implications that we're not especially going to talk about today in terms of like her analysis of like religiosity and whatnot. Like you could do a whole like Mary Douglas purity and danger thing here. But I want to just read what I think is a very helpful passage about the relationship to food waste. And before I do that, I want to say, again, in this essay, this is not where she talks the most about the maternal body. But that is also a really paradigmatic example of this thing. It's not one thing and it's not two things. And people who are both experiencing pregnancy and people who are in relation to the pregnant body both experience it as abject, experience themselves as abject, but also that this is a way of accounting for like a fundamentally like misogynist relationship to the pregnant body, is that there's a horror about it, that it's like, I thought you were this subject, but also maybe you're this object, and I thought you were this one, but maybe you're this two, and maybe it's like 1.5, and like I don't even really know. And so we could spin that out. But anyway, here's the passage where, so it's like, if you think about the abject, if you learn anything from this podcast today, think about the abject in relationship to the maternal body, in that sort of undecidability of number, and the fact that all of these like oozy things are coming out even more than regular human bodies. I mean, I don't know if that's actually true, but it's true in a certain like cultural imaginary sort of way. And think about it in terms of foods that fucking squick you out, okay? For Kristeva, this all actually collides in breast milk and our relationship to breast milk. Here, I'm going to read about food loathing and the way, and Dan, I think this is going to get to some of what you want to talk about, the way that food loathing does something to the self in some sort of fundamental way. Okay. Loathing an item of food, a piece of filth, waste, or dung. The spasms and vomiting that protect me. The repugnance, the retching that thrusts me to the side and turns me away from defilement, sewage, and muck. The shame of compromise, of being in the middle of treachery. The fascinated start that leads me toward and separates me from them. Food loathing is perhaps the most elementary and most archaic form of abjection. When the eyes see or the lips touch that skin on the surface of milk, sidebar, ew, harmless, thin as a sheet of cigarette paper, pitiful as a nail paring, I experience a gagging sensation. And still farther down, spasms in the stomach, the belly, and all the organs shrivel up the body, provoke tears and bile, increase heartbeat, cause forehead and hands to perspire. Along with sight-clouding dizziness, nausea makes me balk at that milk cream, separates me from the mother and father who proffer it. I want none of that element, sign of their desire. She has I in quotes here through all this, I do not want to listen. I do not assimilate it. I expel it. But since the food is not an other for me, who am only in their desire, I expel myself. I spit myself out. I abject myself within the same motion through which I claim to establish myself.
I love, by the way, this resonance. I don't know if it's a false etymological friend or not between like the wretched and retching in terms
Yeah,
of
I was
like
just thinking
being
about that
nauseated.
too. It might be a false friend.
We'll also talk about like, again, this theme in this era of French thought, and I hate to go back to the being and nothingness stuff of like nausea as doing existential work, right?
Sure.
It's both a feeling, but also like a state that indexes something.
Yeah.
But if you'll forgive me continuing in our gross vein, this speaks to what we opened with, Dan, about like the distinction between this and the uncanny, right? Insofar as that the uncanny is this dysphoric feeling of unfamiliarity that kind of makes you not feel at home where you should feel the safest. Here for Kristeva, whatever the abject is related to this ongoing process of self-constitution and implicates the grounds of possibility for the self, right? And the examples that she gives, in addition to these, and maybe there's other, again, forgive me, I'm being very earthy here, right? And I should say, for those of you all who are psychoanalytic in training or orientation more explicitly, this probably shouldn't be one way to get a handle on this. Might be to think about this, like the way to entertain this type of stuff is on the level you might like deal with like Klein, for example, right? Where it's like a grammar of pissing and shitting and insides and outsides and eating and expelling, etc. Right? These basic sort of operations of organic life that we have got going for better and for worse. But like, just to be very frank about this, like like the ways in which we establish ourselves as beings are messy. Right? Or even like that beginning of like, how do you know that you're pregnant? Right? Well, you skip your period, right? Maybe, which is another one of these things that is you, but not you, and subject of all these taboos and revulsions and different social orders.
Yeah, menstrual blood's a great example.
Or maybe you start getting morning sickness. In other words, you start throwing up all over the place. You're like, well, yay, I guess I have a little person inside me, right? Like there's this kind of moment of like engagement with the body or like the body revealing itself to you that is not how it's supposed to work, but actually how it does work. And then suddenly you're like, oh, actually, this is how it's supposed to work, right? It's this, again, these moments of like vertiginous nausea. The other examples that I think that are germane here too, and Abby, you already alluded to these, are related to beginning and endings respectively. Namely, think about like afterbirth or like the placenta.
The placenta.
Or on the other hand, think about the corpse. Both of those things are things that are respectively the condition of possibility for your being, right? You cannot have come into being without a placenta that, gives you these nutrients. And we all know where we're going. We're going to be corpses someday. So they're on a continuum with us. And yet also when we get too close to them, we start feeling really icky and horrible. And then when you layer on like additional possibilities for transgression or uneasiness, they take on these added moral valences, like, cannibalism, grotesque, the stuff of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
And decay.
Rot, putrefaction.
But of a body.
Yeah.
Right?
I have to share a memory I have, if you'll forgive me, of...
Is it gross?
Yes. Late one night in my, like 12 or 13 with some friends of mine watching TV, and it was like one of those like HBO, like you're getting the brief moments where it's like static on the screen, but you can still see it, right? And it was like some like it was like some late night thing, like the theme of which was like basically German people doing stuff that's weird and bizarre, right? It's very like Vice coded now. It's like some guy in a fedora being like, look what this strange community of freakish people do. But it were all these people who were somehow sneaking placentas out of hospitals to eat them. And they like fried it up in this big pan. It was like a flesh latke. And they were like, it tastes like blood sausage. And I remember being like, adulthood is horrible. Germany is terrible. What the fuck is going on? We just wanted to see breasts. Like, this is not, we were looking for Skinamax. This is something else entirely. And yeah, again, like if this is making you squirm,
then you're listening.
Then you're vibing with this text, right? That's what the abject, yeah.
I really want to, I want to talk a little bit more. I'm sorry. I want to talk a little bit more about corpses. Sure. A sentence that I have not said before. But I want to take a didactic moment here first, just to say, because we haven't done Kristeva before, that another way of thinking about this and zooming back out as Patrick did at the very beginning and thinking about this in the context of like quote unquote French theory and, a word that we haven't really invoked today so much, but like postmodernism, poststructuralism. Poststructuralism is kind of the one I would use. But when you think about the idea of postmodern subjectivity, right? That is more something that people have a sense of is like, oh, all of a sudden, like there are so many different theoretical ways of talking about like the shattering of the self. And Kristeva, whenever she talks about the subject in a lot of her other work, She refers to it as, in French, the sujet en procès. And if you translate that, and this is the way that it's always translated, it's sort of like infelicitous in English, but it is always because it's again, like Patrick was saying, there's a pun. It's not only the subject in process, right, to index that there's like this ongoing pissing, shitting, menstruating, giving birth, right? That like, how could you ever think about subjectivity as something that's fixed when we are these bodily creatures that are actually like, I was going to say all holes, but that's like not, I mean, it's not
It's
right,
not far
but
off.
it's not totally wrong. We got a lot of pores too, right? We're sweating. We're secreting. None of this stuff is ever stable. But the other translation in French of procès is trial. So it's the subject in process on trial. And you can hear that in any number of ways. It is a trial to be a subject, right? But also like the jury trial, like the integrity of the self is always being put on trial. So hear that when you're hearing us talk in some ways like this is one way of her getting at the instability or the fragmentation of the subject, right? Which on this podcast is something that we generally talk about as like an achievement to be desired, right? Because you need a certain amount of stable sense of self to be an efficacious being in the world. But, there's a metaphysical claim here that is like fundamentally like a wrong-headed way of understanding what it is to be a person. Didactic professor moment over, going back to corpses. In the discussion of corpses, and yes, there is a discussion of corpses in this piece, and I will not read the entirety of it. But I want to use this discussion to segue us to another thing that I think is super, super important about this concept, especially when it comes to using it for purposes of political analysis, which is that the corpse is something that not only creates this sense of abjection and that we experience as abject and that throws the self into this sort of like flurry of disorganization by understanding that like, yes, we have a beginning and an end and that is our end. Kristeva says, and she's talking about an alive person in relation to the corpse. She says, there I am at the border of my condition as a living being. And to return to the food waste/waste, skipping down a little here. She says, if dung signifies, and of course, think about that, like when you die, you piss yourself, you shit yourself, right? Okay, if dung signifies the other side of the border, the place where I am not and which permits me to be, the corpse, the most sickening of wastes, is a border that has encroached upon everything. It is no longer I who expel. I is expelled. The border has become an object. How can I be without border? Close quote. The border here is the border between the inside and outside, as Patrick was saying. It's the border between life and death. It's the border between subject and object. But this isn't, this is where I'm like pushing back a little bit against Patrick's invocation of existentialism, even though I think it's totally fine. It's just not how I read this. This isn't the sort of idea that you're like, I see a corpse and I realize I'm going to die and I have like an existential realization. This is much, much more immediate, right? It is actually that the corpse, and again, that like the decaying corpse, right? There is something that is much more upsetting about the decay of a human body than like, I don't know, a rat dies in your walls. That's not great either.
No, yeah.
All right. That's also a pretty good example of abjection. You're living with something like that. But there's something about the encounter. And again, this is like a visceral rather than an intellectual realization that is so vertiginous that the subject object binary fractures.
And I think that's absolutely right, Abby. And I'll agree with you too. Like, I think if for the existentialist, the sight of the corpse is the spur, or to use Kristeva's language, the primer for a series of propositional reflections, for her, it's a affective, overwhelming kind of scramble, right? It undoes not just like your own self-constitution, but it threatens all these other sort of binary oppositions and logics and border maintenances that you have to like work with it somehow. You have to reassert them, but also you find yourself like really fascinated by these limit cases.
Yes,
right?
that's so important, right?
That added valence of like fascination or pleasure or fixation on the thing is another thing that's not present quite in the existential account either, but that also Kristeva wants to talk about, where like we're kind of drawn to this limit too, maybe a little bit, or we're drawn to the things that take us to that limit. Right? We love getting on the roller coaster and then throwing up, maybe, even if it does make us like, or another way of saying this is there's this kind of strange attraction to sites of or experiences of the abject, or like we're interested or implicated, or maybe even using psychoanalytic language, we're interpolated by the abject, even as we interpolate them into other types of orders of like, well, to use language of political theorists, these subjects or others that are revolting to us become objects of fascination and pleasure, but also where we want to project dominance. And an example I think that immediately just comes to mind that feels directly organic here is think about right-wing types going on and on about the horrifying, grotesque mystery of what trans people do in bathrooms.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I've been up all night doing research about what it is trans people do in bathrooms. I was like, well, spoiler alert, they piss and shit and I don't know, like do coke and do their makeup in there, like just like anybody fucking else, right? But somehow we are drawn to this site of not just bodily functions, but of like, for the right-wing subject here, transgressions of bodily boundaries.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember if Kristeva uses precisely this language, but the vibe that I picked up from it was that abjection being like a rejection that spurs passions, which I love that like smash up of language. And you're just there at the end talking about the conservative types. This is another thought that I kept having throughout this paper was she talks a lot about the other and the role of the other in this abjecting or in ruling things to be abject. It seems to also throw, like, not only are you doing work to identify yourself, doing work to identify somebody else, but it's also through the gaze of the other at one level or another. And she gets close to, and you tell me if I'm misreading that, but she seems to get close to talking about a kind of performativity. There's the literal viscera of seeing a corpse, like spilling its guts out. But then there's this like viscera by proxy, like I guess the word I'm looking for is purity. There's this like performance
and that's where I'm
aspect
going
to
next,
this.
Dan.
You're
keep setting
me
up.
This is great.
Okay, you're Dan. You're like, you're reading my mind here because you're setting me up for the last aspect of this piece that I want to get into. And here, this is thinking about the other, as you say, not only in the sense of like the individual, but also like the big other, right?
Yeah.
So the last thing that I think is really essential to extract from this piece is the relationship of the abject to systems and institutions. And this isn't like 100% different from what we were talking about with borders, but just given where we want to go, I think it's worth spending a few moments with. Okay. So this is Kristeva, and there's just like a couple of quick passages I want to read from different parts of this essay. So first, quote, "It is thus not lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order. What does not respect borders, positions, rules. The in-between, the ambiguous, the composite," close quote. Okay, that's one. Another passage on the containment of abjection, because we are interested, I think, politically in both the creation and the maintenance, but also the ways in which the abject is made to appear as contained and to be this thing that you, reader of the New York Times, could not possibly experience. Quote, an unshakable adherence to prohibition and law is necessary if that perverse interspace of abjection is to be hemmed in and thrust aside. Religion, morality, law. Obviously always arbitrary, more or less. Unfailingly oppressive, rather more than less. Laboriously prevailing, more and more so.
Dan, you're so on point to invoke the religious dimensions of this, or at least these logics of like purity and purification, or of what Kristeva might call like catharsis and otherwise, right? Insofar as that what's at stake here is sort of we could look at it from two directions. One, the people who are experiencing the horror of the abject and then double down or produce a series of compensatory mechanisms to contain it, like literally contain it, and build on top of it, which both involves a type of denial and erasure, but also a type of mythification about origins, etc. And, the classic example here, since, what's at stake for Kristeva exemplarily, and what's not there for Freud, is the repression of the maternal or maternal repressed, right? This is why she's interested in a critique of what she calls Freud's primal repression, here's an origin myth for everybody. The idea of the virgin birth or the immaculate conception, right? Mary, the mother of God or the mother of Jesus, was able to produce a child. Yes, admittedly from her womb. We have to acknowledge at least that bit, depending on how our creedal commitments. But there was no fucking. There were no fluids, right? In this quintessentially misogynistic, in its implications, gesture, we want to make her body as unbody-like as possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Or think about social contract theory that like literally has the founding of a state without any mention of like the reproduction of people.
Exactly. And this then produces an entire both logics of like self-hatred among women, but also an entire misogynistic culture, right? Where women are understood as producing. They are abjected by all these mechanisms, whether it be, I don't know, like the destruction of the healthcare apparatus for people who are pregnant, or the hatred of quote unquote nasty women by Trump, right?
Oh man, I haven't thought about that in a while.
Bleeding out of her, where.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the related kind of reclamation of the abject.
We'll go to that in a second.
The position of the abject. I'm sorry, I'm teasing
that's excellent. Yeah, but like I think that again, like what the abject is getting at here then is like, how do we both include yet exclude people who we are fascinated with and depend on, but also produce are like both objects or of horrifying conditions. We put them in that, but who sort of like have to experience horror because of what we do to them. Or another way of saying this is, how do we both, and we, I mean here, these are the people who are, in the center of power, right? How do we continually keep people on the margins without ejecting them from what's called the public sphere?
Right.
Right.
Staying within while nonetheless they are not ejected, they're abjected.
Right. And even if they are being ejected in the sense that we are eventually going to quote unquote deport them, we want to have them all in Alligator Alcatraz for us to see.
Yes.
Right. And that's going to be a big show.
In this literal swamp. Like, I mean, I have to say Alligator Alcatraz was the other reason that I was thinking about this idea, because like, I mean, it is, well, I mean, it's fucking viscerally horrifying, right? Like, just to exist in a world where it exists, I feel it's disgusting.
Yeah. These people from the shithole countries are getting stuck in this, quote unquote, shithole countries are getting stuck in this, like, again, note how we always call it a foreign gulag for some fucking, like, the phrase gulag is never a domestic one, but like a domestic gulag.
It is.
Right.
It is.
Which is also, a concentration camp, etc. Right.
Like the other thing about it is literally wet.
It's a breeding ground for typhus. It's so fucking, people are gonna die or gonna drop like flies there, right? And I should say, like, no, it's like, how do we keep people on the margins without totally ejecting them? Because to some extent, they are necessary for this entire disciplinary scheme and logic, right? And so, like, figures like Noah McCarthy, reading Judith Butler and Klein, respectively, or Kelly Oliver and others, will like note how these creations of the state, right, of a regime of political subjects, involves a correlative kind of continual conjuring of abject subjects, right, who are on the borders, who threaten the borders, and who are maybe let in, but also never truly included, right? Think too about all these scenes about, like, and liberals do this too, like horrifying scenes in the refugee camp. And you're like, well, I mean, where are these people coming from? They're coming from somewhere in particular. They're particular agents that are doing these things to them. But instead, it's just a scene of horror. Like literally, it's conjuring the abject every night for you instead of actually talking about, I know who's actually killing them with the missiles that we're selling, the government that's doing it, right? There are these kind of logics of, look at these monsters, like this monstrosity is another helpful term here because monsters, the term comes from the word to show, right? Here are these monsters. They're not you. Maybe they could be you, but at least they're not you for now. In any event, let's both include and punish them. And this gets at another feature of the religious stuff too, right? Which is one thing Kristeva wants the abject to do, is to clarify how people in power can simultaneously cling to a type of like martyrdom, masochistic display of their own victimization while simultaneously victimizing others. I am so abject. I am the biggest victim in the world, I say, referring to the people being nasty in my mentions, as I send people to the camps, right? And again, these are always overlapping systems of making vulnerable and abject, right? The people on the margins. And I should say, there's an abundance of literature using the term of abjection to think about population of disabled people.
Absolutely.
People, who are queer or trans. Obviously, there's all sorts of overlaps in this, logics of race, and there's a whole bunch of histories of the U.S. that will emphasize the way in which the term abject and the creation of abject populations is always there, right? These abject wretches that are the Indians, it's a line I think in Thomas Jefferson or something similar. Like they're always crying out for uplift. How do we uplift them? Well, by killing a lot of them and sending some of them to reservations. And,
Right.
it's again, inclusion, exclusion, liquidation, fascination. And it's always this ongoing process.
One of the other kinds of work that the abject does, and again, thinking about it as paradigmatically about horror of the female body, which is not limited to people who don't actually have such bodies, right? And particularly the maternal body, but like it is the female body that Kristeva is thinking about here. Is think about also all of the ways in which hatred of the maternal gets named, hatred of the maternal and hatred of women, but particularly of this figure of the devouring mother that makes you not the self that you want to be, that individual self, pulling yourself up by your fucking bootstraps, right? The mommy state, the nanny state, the rhetoric since Reagan of the welfare queen, right? Which of course, is, as we know, is a lie. But what we're talking about here is like analysis of the ways in which anything that might be construed as helping people who other people do not deem worthy of that help is named in those terms and is thus disgusting. And it's a waste, right? Like here, the word waste and a waste and the idea of wasting money, along with dung, waste products, things, and of course we're talking about people here, but understood as things to be expelled rather than held, cosseted, cared for.
And I think the other valence of waste here too is a verb, like you're laying waste to people, right? You're making people disposable. And here I think of Nancy Eisenberg's book on white trash and on class in general, right? One of the ways in which like literally the North American continent was made, quote unquote, like productive was by literally just sending people in it to die, right? Whether they be the populations of slaves or indigenous from the African slave trade or just like poor whites, right? There is this notion that people are made disposable. They are laid waste to in order to keep the system going. We can connect all this type of like these creations of people who are going to be wasted or laid waste to in the names of some type of efficiency with these additional like contortions of like, virgin birth style, contradictory, or even psychotic ideological formations, right? For example, I don't know, I'm thinking about all these people simultaneously who are so upset about quote unquote national birth rates, yet also
fucking
are
pronatalists.
Just complete. Well, I mean, there are a lot of even like non-pronatalist, like neoliberal types who are very concerned about, to be very blunt about this, how fast these Palestinians are breeding. Right? Or how fast these others just keep on popping out babies, right? There's this sort of sense that look at these horrifying others who are doing all this stuff.
Yeah.
Let's make things even harder for the women that we are supposedly trying to help and who identify with us at the same time. Like, again, it's contradictory, it's catalogic, but it follows a logic of abjection and revulsion, right? To use language that others have as well. Here are these revolting subjects, right? They are revolting to us in the sense that they make us disgusted, but maybe they're also representative of a threat of political subversion or danger.
Revolution.
And thus we must dominate them.
Lay waste to them.
And for those of you who are curious too, like this is also why Kristeva is so interested in Celine and his antisemitism, because she takes this as a similar sort of formation. The antisemitism of the fantasies, or rather the antisemitism of Celine maps onto this fantasy where he's like, I want to go back to, I don't want to be consumed by the state. I want a state before it was ruined by quote unquote the Jews, right?
Yeah.
Which again is,
it's all of this stuff that is about purity and pollution, right? And I think it's very easy to hear it, as Kristeva certainly wants you to hear it, along the axis of gender, but not exclusively by any means, right? We are talking about abjection is something that, how do I want to put this? You don't want it for yourself, but if it were totally gone, there would be nothing to protect yourself from. And so that is why we have a domestic gulag.
first they came for the abject, right? And that's good.
Right.
Because I can never be abject. There will always be a first abject. There's always, again, no, this is from the perspective of power. There is always this population. And it's the continual ongoing creation of that population in all its disgusting deservedness of what it's going to get that keeps me safe, but also keeps me me. That's how I know I'm me, because I'm not them.
Right.
But also I'm fascinated by them.
The other thing that I wanted to throw in there is look at the charts, look at the infographics about what Trump's new bill is producing. You don't need the language of abjection to say this is further immiserating the already immiserated. But you can think about it as a kind of like statement about amplifying abjection, right? And also like literally increasing that population. I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had here, of course, about like income inequality. But I do think that like one of the things that we're talking about, and like, look, you can go and find yourself on that chart and be like, what is this going to mean for my taxes? And it's a really clear, I mean, it's like a shockingly clear statement that is like, if you are below a certain threshold, you are already waste, and we are going to squeeze every last bit out of you. And if you are in that charmed circle, well, you might be morally offended by this. But guess what? Your tax burden is going to go down.
And you have psychotic style figures like J.D. Vance, you know, God's gift to the world with his own sort of virgin birth or like strange narrative of origins among the abjected class now being like, well, the minutiae of healthcare policy aside, we are spending $130 billion to get rid of the people who are the real threat, namely these grotesque, you know, migrants. It's all horrifying. Maybe abjection gives us some sort of scaffold for thinking about and identifying it in the world. The other thing to say, and I think this is also, I know we can close with, from the perspective of the people being abjected, there are strategies that involve claiming that abjection, right? Or not just calling attention to it, but like using its terms to resist the operations of power.
Absolutely.
Right? Think about the appropriation isn't quite the right word, but the reclamation of terms like queer or crip by communities of activists, right? Who have identified what is being done to them, but also understood themselves as populations that are not reducible to the operations of power, right? As having their own sort of organic rights and perspectives and needs and demands. And I think that's another way for thinking about like the other half of this equation, namely how the abjected can stake claims as subjects to transforming the political order in ways that are not, you know, the Celine style, J.D. Vance style, let's go back to the thing that never existed, right? To the mother that will not overwhelm us, but that we wish we could have.
Yeah. I mean, and I think what you're saying is so important, Patrick. But I also think, and at the level of our contemporary political moment, what we are seeing is that the fear of abjection lessens or even disables compassion.
It becomes a hatred of vulnerability.
Yes.
And that is all too recognizable and has to be rejected.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Klutchen, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.
Love you.